The morning I was told to leave, the sky looked exactly the same as it had the day. I was born soft, grey, and watching. It wasn't raining, but the kind of clouded stillness that made you feel like something was about to fall. Inside the cottage, everything had the weight of silence. My mother moved slowly, her hand stirring ashes that wouldn't catch fire. The hearth remained dark. She didn't speak. My father stood near the door, not looking at me, not looking at anything in particular. He gripped the wooden frame like he needed something to hold him up. My bag had already been packed. I hadn't seen it done. It was just there that morning by the stool beside the wall, neatly tied with twine, like a parcel to be delivered. A pair of woolen dresses, the good shoes I only wore to church, the comb with one missing tooth. My little brother sat at the table, eating porridge that had gone cold. He didn't know what was happening. Maybe no one really did. I was 15. I had never kissed anyone. I had never been kissed. And yet I was promised to a boy whose name had not been spoken, to a family I'd never seen, to a place no one described. The arrangement had been made in low voices after supper, behind a closed door. I was told the next morning, with words that felt like rope, short, tight, and pulling. Get ready, my father said. You're leaving at first. Light. That was all. My mother wept that night. Not loudly, just a quiet trembling in the next room. I didn't cry. I folded the shawl my grandmother had left me and placed it on top of the bag. I waited for sleep that didn't come. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a hush, as if even nature had agreed not to wake me. And when morning came, I wasn't sure whether to be grateful or afraid that it had dot. It was my uncle who hitched the cart. I remember the way he pulled the leather strap with one hand and wiped his forehead with the other, like the air itself weighed more than usual. He didn't ask if I was scared. He didn't ask anything really, just said, we'll make it by dusk if the road holds. I climbed into the back without help, without a word. The wooden slats were damp with morning mist, and the blanket they'd left for me smelled like the barn hay, old wool, and something faintly bitter. I sat with my hands folded, watching as the cottage shrank behind us. My brother was at the window. He pressed his fingers to the glass, his breath fogging a small circle. I smiled, just barely, and lifted one hand. Not a wave, just enough so he'd know I saw him. My mother stood at the edge of the yard, her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes rimmed red. She didn't move. Father wasn't there. I think he'd gone to the fields early, as if planting barley could make him forget what was happening. The cart creaked down the familiar path, past the old oak where I used to leave trinkets in the hollow, believing fairies might come. We passed the mill, then the stream, then the stone fence that marked the edge of our land. Everything I had ever known faded slowly behind me like morning fog giving way to sun. But the sun never came, only more grey, more cold. I tried to memorize the sound of our gate as it closed, the way the earth smelled after rain, the rhythm of wheels on frozen dirt, because I knew somewhere deep beneath the stillness of my chest that I would not return. Not as I was. Maybe not at all. And as we turned north, past the last curve of the hill, I let my eyes rest one last time on the place that had held my childhood. It did not wave back. It did not beg me to stay. It simply let me go. The road north was narrow, and the trees began to lean closer together as the day went on, their branches brushing like whispers overhead. Uncle kept to himself, guiding the cart with a quiet focus, as though every turn of the wheel required prayer. The horses seemed to understand the weight of the moment. They didn't neigh or pull, just moved steadily forward, hooves crunching the frosted dirt with slow rhythm. I watched the woods blur past. Every so often, we passed another traveller, or farmer, but no one looked long. In that part of the valley, everyone knew when a girl was being taken somewhere she hadn't chosen. They didn't stop. They didn't ask. Around midday, we paused beneath an ash tree to eat. Uncle gave me half a loaf of bread and a dried apple, but I wasn't hungry. I took small bites anyway, so he wouldn't think I was weak. He said nothing, only glanced at the sky and muttered, "Still time enough." Then we moved on. I think I drifted to sleep for a while, head against the side of the car, the rhythm of the road and the soft creak of the wheels lulling me into a place between dream and memory. I dreamt of the willow tree, of my mother braiding my hair, of my own voice humming a lullaby I hadn't sung in years. When I woke, it was late afternoon, and the forest had thickened. Shadows stretched longer. The light turned silver, then blue. Uncle said we'd stay the night in a barn near the fork in the road. They've kept hay clean, he said. You would freeze. I nodded. He didn't mean to be cruel. He just didn't know what to say. No one ever does when you're leaving behind one life for another you didn't ask for. That night, lying on straw, I listened to the wind seep through the boards and wondered if the boy I would marry was staring at the same sky. I wondered if he even knew I was coming, or if, like me, he too had been promised before he ever kissed anyone. The house appeared just as the sun disappeared, tall, narrow, and made of stone that looked older than memory. It stood at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by pines that whispered even when the wind was still. The roof was steep, the windows small and watching, like eyes that didn't blink. A thin line of smoke curled from the chimney, but no warmth came from it. As we approached, I felt my hands grow colder, even though I kept them tucked beneath my shawl. Uncle said nothing, only gave the reins a gentle tug as the car came to a halt in front of the steps. "This is it," he said, not quite looking at me. "They'll come for you." He didn't move to help me down. He didn't wait for the door to open. I stepped off the cart on my own, boots landing in soft dirt, the hem of my dress catching a bit of frost. My bag was handed to me without ceremony, without a final word. I turned to thank him, but he had already clicked the reins and turned back down the path. I watched until the trees swallowed him. Then I was alone, a girl at the edge of a house she'd never seen, with a name she wasn't allowed to know, promised to a future she hadn't chosen. The door opened slowly, and a woman stepped out. She wore grey, her hair pinned tightly back, her mouth a single line. She looked at me as if she had been waiting not for me, but for another burden to carry. "Come inside," she said, and nothing more. The voice was not unkind, but it had no softness. I followed her into the dim hallway, where the air smelled of smoke and stone, and something sweet trying to fade. My footsteps echoed behind hers, and I noticed that the walls held no portraits, no flowers, no light. Just long, dark wood and the sound of my future stretching into silence. She led me through a corridor that curved gently to the right, where a single candle flickered against the stone. I couldn't hear much beyond the sound of our footsteps, and the faint crackle of something burning in a distant room. The house was quiet, not the kind of quiet that invites peace, but the kind that presses on your chest, like a room holding its breath. We passed a staircase with a wooden rail once smoothed by time, and I wondered how many feet had touched those steps before mine. She stopped in front of a narrow door and turned the handle slowly. "This will be your room," she said, motioning for me to enter. I stepped inside. It was small but clean, a narrow bed beneath a slanted window, a pitcher and bowl on the stand, and a folded blanket at the foot. No mirror, no books, nothing to remind me of who I had been yesterday. "Supper is in an hour," she added, dressed modestly, and then she left, closing the door without a sound. I stood in the center of the room for a long time, unsure whether to sit, to cry, or to pray. I removed my shawl and placed it on the hook by the wall, then sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was firm, but not unkind. I could hear the wind picking up outside, brushing against the house like it too. Wanting to come in, I looked at the window. The view showed a patch of forest and a bit of sky already turning to ink. Somewhere behind those trees was home my mother, my brother, the willow, the stream. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine their voices, their laughter, even their silences. But it all felt far away now, like a dream that had already begun to fade. I touched the comb in my pocket, the one with the missing tooth. It felt like the only thing still mine. And as the light drained from the sky, I told myself I would be brave because no one else had asked if I wanted to be. The bell rang low and distant one long tone, as if the house itself sighed. I stood slowly, smoothing the folds of my dress with trembling hands. I hadn't eaten since the morning, but hunger had knotted itself into something quieter, more like a shadow than a need. I opened the small chest at the foot of the bed and found a plain blue gown folded neatly, a ribbon tucked beside it. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. I changed carefully, brushing invisible dust from my shoulders, and tied my hair back with the ribbon, even though I wasn't sure if it was meant for me. The hallway was dim when I stepped out. Candles flickered in their sconces, casting soft shapes on the walls that looked like moving hands. I followed the scent of bread and something warm, potatoes, maybe, or lentils, and soon found myself at the threshold of a large dining room. There were only 4 people seated. The woman who had welcomed me, a younger maid with downcast eyes, a man who looked older than his years, and a boy around my age. I knew, without being told, that he was the one I had been promised to. He didn't look up. He held a spoon in one hand, the other resting limp on the table. His hair was dark, like ink in water, and his posture was rigid, like he had practiced stillness. "Sit," the woman said, pointing to the empty chair across from him. I obeyed. No one introduced him. No one said his name. The soup was poured, bread passed silently, and the only sound in the room was the clink of metal against porcelain. I stole a glance at him once. His eyes flicked toward me, then away. There was no cruelty in them, only distance, as if I were already part of the furniture, or a cloud outside the window. I wanted to speak, to say hello, or ask what he liked to read, or if he, too, had not wanted this. But the silence was thicker than the soup, and no one had taught me how to break it. Days passed away, dust settles quietly, without asking. Each morning began the same. A soft knock at the door, the sound of fabric shifting as the maid left clean water, and a folded dress near the stool. I would rise without speaking, wash in the bowl, dress slowly, and braid my hair while watching the frost melt on the window pane. The house didn't wake up so much as exhale. Even the birds outside seemed to sing softer here, as if out of respect for something buried. I hadn't spoken to him since that first dinner. We shared a table twice a day, exchanging glances that said nothing. Sometimes I caught him watching the fire instead of eating. Other times, I saw him reading a letter beneath the table, folding and unfolding the same piece of paper like it could offer a way out. I wondered if it was from someone he loved, someone he hadn't chosen to leave. His name had not been spoken once, not by the maid, not by the woman who ran the house, not even in a whisper between servants. I asked no questions. I was not raised to pry. But each day, my mind wrapped tighter around the silence. I began naming him in my thoughts. Not truly, but in pieces. He became the boy with quiet eyes, then the one who reads when the soup cools, then he who folds paper like it's glass. I told myself stories about him before I fell asleep, imagined he had once smiled freely, that maybe he too had sat under a willow tree and dreamed of becoming something other than a name in someone else's deal. I didn't know if he was kind. I didn't know if he even wanted me here, but I knew, with that strange certainty that comes without logic, that he was also trapped. And in that, we were already closer than the words we never spoke. One morning, just as the frost had begun to pull back from the garden wall, I found him in the library. I hadn't meant to enter. It was a door I hadn't noticed before, tucked between two tall cupboards near the back stairs. I was chasing sunlight, hoping to stand where it touched the floor for a few minutes before breakfast. But when I opened the door, there he was, sitting near the window, a book resting in his lap. He looked up, surprised, but not startled. I froze. We stood in that soft pause for a breath longer than comfort allowed. Then, without a word, he closed the book, not harshly, and placed it on the table beside him. "You can come in," he said. His voice was quieter than I expected. Steady, not cold. I stepped forward, unsure what to say, unsure if I was allowed to say anything. The room smelled like old paper and dust warmed by light. It wasn't a large library to walls of shelves, a fireplace gone cold, to chairs, and a rug one at the corners, but it felt like it belonged to someone who needed it. I didn't sit. He didn't offer. "You read often?" I asked finally. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, like it had aged while I was silent. He nodded. "It helps," he said simply. I wanted to ask what it helped with. Loneliness? Memory? Waiting? But I said nothing. He looked at me then. Not just glanced, but truly looked. And for the first time, I saw him not as a stranger, but as someone who might have been carrying a life. He didn't ask for either. "You don't have to be afraid here," he said. Then he stood, walked past me, and gently pulled the door closed behind him. I remained there for a while, standing in a room full of names I could read while still not knowing the one I needed most. That night, I dreamt of names. Not spoken, not written, just the sensation of them. I felt them like wind on skin, like water passing over fingers. Names without syllables, meanings without language. I woke before dawn, heart slow but alert, as if someone had whispered something, just out of reach. The fire in my room had gone out during the night, and the air was sharp with morning cold. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and sat by the window, watching the sky change color behind the trees. Somewhere in the silence, I heard footsteps outside my door. I thought, though I couldn't be sure. The house had grown, familiar in its sounds, and each creak or knock had started to develop a name of its own. But not him. Still not him. At breakfast, he sat beside me for the first time, not across. The bread was fresh, the butter soft, and though we said nothing, there was something different in the space between us. He passed me the salt without being asked. I refilled his cup without looking up. It felt like a language, ancient and wordless. After the meal, he stood before I did and waited. When I rose, he walked beside me, not ahead, not behind, and we returned to the hallway in silence.
Before we parted, he said quietly, "Would you like to see the stables this afternoon?"
I nodded.
"Yes," I said.
Just that. It was the first time I had agreed to something that was not expected of me, and in that moment, I didn't care what his name was.
I didn't need it to feel something start to grow between us, like ivy on stone slow, patient, unnoticed by most. Perhaps the name would come later, in its own time. Or perhaps, I thought as I returned to my room, some names are not given,
All at once. Some are earned like trust,
or allowed, like breathing.
or chosen in silence, when both hearts have finally stopped trying to run. The stables sat behind the house, just beyond the vegetable garden and a row of frostbitten lavender.
They were older than I expected stone walls, wooden beams darkened by years of breath and rain, and a door that creaked in a way that sounded
Like an old man clearing his throat.
He led me there without speaking, his hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against the cold.
I followed, a step behind, unsure if I was a guest or a shadow. The horses stirred as we entered,
Their bodies warm and slow in the morning light. One of them chestnut brown with a pale stripe down its nose stepped forward to meet him.
He reached up and stroked its muzzle, and for a moment, something in his face softened. Her name's Brisa, he said. She was born the same year.
"I lost my brother." The words hung in the air, tender and heavy. I didn't know what to say, so I just stepped closer and let the horse nudge my hand. Her breath was warm, and her eyes were steady.
He was older?
I asked quietly.
He nodded. By for years.
He was meant to inherit everything. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw the quiet weight in his posture, the way responsibility had settled into his bones before it should have.
And now it's you, I said, not a question.
Just the truth.
He didn't answer, just kept, stroking Brisa's neck, his hand slow and constant. Do you miss him? I whispered. He didn't look at me. Every day, he said.
And for the first time since I arrived, I saw the boy I would marry not as someone distant or mysterious, but as someone mourning something he could never explain.
I didn't touch him. I didn't speak.
I just stood beside him, breathing in
the scent of hay and horses and loss. And in that silence, something between us stopped holding back. After the stables, we walked back slowly, not because the path was long, but because neither of us seemed eager to return inside. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of wood smoke and winter.
Leaves crunched under our boots in soft, uneven rhythms, and our shadows stretched long across the ground, touching but never overlapping. I didn't know what this was, this quiet between us, but it felt different now, less like distance, more like a shared hush. He glanced at me once, not with a question or a smile, but with the kind of look that says, "You're still here."
I see that. I nodded, just once. Not because I knew what he meant, but because I wanted to answer something anyway. When we reached the back door, he opened it for me, then paused before following. The library's yours too, you know, he said softly.
"You don't have to wait for me to be there." I looked at him, unsure how to respond.
Thank you, I whispered, and meant it more than he probably understood. Inside, the house felt less heavy. The shadows didn't lean as sharply. Even the silence seemed to loosen its grip, just a little.
That afternoon, I returned to the library alone.
I chose a book at random, one with a cracked spine and pages that smelled like sleep. I didn't read much. I just sat in the chair he had left behind, letting my body sink into its memory. The warmth from the sun through the window reached only one arm, but it was enough.
I traced the edges of the page with my finger, listening
to the wind outside and the soft tick of the mantel clock.
For the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel like a guest.
I didn't feel like someone waiting to be claimed.
I felt, if only for an hour, like someone who belonged somewhere. And in that stillness, I let myself wonder again what his name might be. Not as a question, but as something that would come.
In time, like the spring thaw or the blooming of a tree no one planted that evening. As dusk settled like ash over the hills, I heard music coming from the far side of the house. Not loud, not meant for performance, just the fragile sound of fingers finding their way across piano keys. I followed it slowly, as if approaching a wild bird. The notes weren't polished, but they were honest, full of pauses and soft hesitations. They felt like someone remembering how to speak after too long in silence. The door to the music room was slightly ajar. I didn't enter. I stood just beyond the threshold, my back resting against the cool wood of the wall, and listened. He was playing. I could tell by the rhythm slow, deliberate, like someone playing for no one but himself. The melody wasn't sad, but it wasn't light either.
It held weight, like pages being turned in a book he'd never finish. I closed my eyes.
The sound wrapped around me, soft and aching, and in that moment, I understood something. He didn't need to tell me his name. Not yet. Maybe not ever.
Because this music, this quiet, this aching thing he gave the air was how he told his story.
When the song ended, I waited for a moment longer, then walked away before he could see me.
I returned to my room and lit the small candle by
the window, watching its flame flicker against the glass. Outside, snow had begun to fall thin, patient, gentle. I thought of the horse, of the folded letter, of the way his voice lowered when he spoke about his brother. I thought of the piano, and how the keys had carried the things he couldn't yet say.
And as I pulled the blanket over my shoulders and laid down in the quiet, I didn't feel alone.
I didn't feel afraid.
I felt like something was beginning.
Slowly, without force.
Like a name being spoken not aloud, but in trust.
And I whispered, "Good night," not knowing if he would ever hear it.
But still, I whispered it, because for the first time, I wanted him to. The days began to stretch, not because time had changed, but because something in me had softened.
I no longer counted the hours between meals or the footsteps outside my door. Instead, I started noticing things I hadn't before: the way the
light spilled into the hallway at a certain hour, the way the maid tucked a sprig of rosemary under the napkin on cold mornings, the way his voice carried when he said thank you to the cook.
He had started speaking more, not often, and never,
about anything large, but enough that I could tell when he was near without turning around. I learned he preferred tea without honey, that he always finished his bread but rarely touched the butter, and that he hummed not a song, just a pattern of sounds when he read.
I still didn't know his name, and though I wanted to ask, I
didn't.
Not yet.
There was something sacred about the silence between us, as if breaking it too soon would make everything collapse.
One afternoon, as I sat in the library flipping through pages I wasn't reading, he entered and stood beside the fire.
He didn't say anything at first,
just warmed his hands, his eyes focused on the flames.
Then softly he said, "Do you write?"
The question surprised me.
I hadn't written since I arrived.
Not even a letter home. Sometimes, I replied. Not well. He turned to me. Would you write something for me?
I blinked, unsure what he meant.
What kind of something?
Anything, he said.
Just something you want remembered. I didn't answer right away.
But that night, I found a sheet of paper in the drawer by my bed. I lit a candle and sat for a long time, listening to the snow tap against the window.
And then, slowly, I began to write, not about him, not yet, but about the girl who had arrived without a name, and the silence that had taught her how to see. The next morning, I folded the page carefully and slipped it between the pages of a book he often left by the fireplace. I didn't tell him. I didn't even sign my name.
There was something comforting in the idea that he might find it by accident, something unclaimed, unannounced. But waiting, that day passed quietly, as most did.
We crossed paths in the hall, exchanged a soft nod at supper, and sat near each
other in the evening while the fire cracked and the clock ticked like a heartbeat no one talked about.
He didn't mention the note. I didn't ask, but the following evening, I returned to the library to find the same book resting on the table, its spine facing outward, as if it had been placed deliberately.
Tucked inside was a page I hadn't
written.
New ink, a different hand.
It wasn't long, just a few lines, but each word carried weight, like it had been chosen slowly. Sometimes silence isn't the absence of words. It's the space where they wait to be safe. I read it. Twice, then again. My hands trembled just slightly, the way they do when something kind brushes against something wounded. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run to bury myself in bed and hide from the feeling growing too quickly inside me.
But another part stayed still, breathing it in like the scent of snow or the moment just before sleep.
The next night, I wrote back just one sentence. And sometimes a name is the last thing to arrive because it waits for the heart to be ready. I left it in a different book.
No signature, no plan.
And so began something soft between us, not a conversation, but a thread.
Invisible, quiet, but growing. With each passing day, our words began filling the gaps the house had left behind.
We never said them aloud, but they were there,
like breath between notes, like hands nearly touching across a table neither of us had chosen, but both had begun to sit with care. It was strange how something so simple, paper, ink, and silence could begin to stitch two lives together.
We never spoke of the notes, never acknowledged their presence when we passed one another in the hallway or sat near the fire in the evening, but the rhythm of it became familiar, almost sacred.
Every night, one of us would leave a thought.
Every morning, the other would find it.
No expectations, no demands.
Just quiet exchanges folded into pages, like secrets slipped beneath a door.
The house, which had once felt too large, too quiet, too heavy with unspoken futures, began to change around us. Or maybe it was we who had changed inside it.
The rooms felt warmer, the silences softer. Even the wind outside seemed less sharp. I started waking with purpose again, not because I had somewhere to be, but because I was slowly becoming someone again. The girl who had arrived promised and voiceless was now someone who could shape a sentence that might matter to someone else, and that mattered to me.
One night, I returned to the library late. The fire had already dimmed, and most of the candles had burned low, but on the table was a book, left open to a blank page.
In the center, in his handwriting, was just one line.
"May I tell you my name?"
My breath caught, not because I didn't want to know, but because the question itself was a gift. He was offering it, not assuming, not insisting, waiting.
I closed the book without writing a reply.
The next morning, as we stood outside near the stables, watching the snow melt into the earth, I looked at him, really looked, and said, "Yes." That was all. One word, but in it lived the beginning of something neither of us had expected.
He smiled, not wide, not quickly, but with that quiet grace he carried like a second coat.
And though he still hadn't said the name aloud, I felt
as if I already knew it.
Not by sound,
but by the way it made me feel safe inside the silence.
He told me his name at twilight, in the orchard behind the stables, where the trees stood bare and the earth smelled like thawing roots. We had gone there to walk, though neither of us said it aloud. It had become our quiet ritual, these walks, with no direction, where the only sound was the crunch of boots over soft earth and the occasional rustle of branches overhead. That evening, the sky was the color of one parchment, and the air held the warmth of a season not yet born. We stopped, beneath the oldest tree, one whose trunk had split years ago, but still bloomed every spring. He placed one hand gently on the bark and said, "My name is Thorn," just that. No embellishment, no story, but the way he said it quietly, deliberately made it feel like he was placing something into my hands.
I repeated it softly, tasting
the shape of it like a promise. Thorn. It suited him not because it was strong or sharp, but because it sounded like something alive that had endured winter. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't dared name before. Trust. Not the kind that arrives easily, but the kind that waits in silence until it knows it will be received with care. I didn't want it to feel like an obligation. He said, "You deserve to choose when it meant something." I nodded, unable to speak. There was too much in my throat: gratitude, sadness, something tender that hadn't yet grown into words. I reached for his hand, just for a moment. It
was warm and calloused, steady, like the roots beneath our feet.
We didn't speak again for a long while. We simply stood beneath the bare branches, the wind curling softly between us, and in that quiet, the name settled between us like a seed, small, full of possibility, waiting for the spring. After that day, something shifted quietly, without
ceremony, like a door that had always been slightly ajar finally opening with ease. We still didn't speak much, but now when we did, there was warmth in the pauses, a shared knowing in the silences that came between words.
I began saying his name in small ways, trying it in the air like one might test the water before stepping.
In
Thorn, would you like to? Thorn, have you read this one? Thorn, just his name, sometimes for no reason at all, except to remember it was mine to say now.
He never corrected me, never flinched or hesitated.
Each time, he simply looked at me not with surprise, but with something steadier.
Something like comfort. The staff noticed, I think.
The maid started placing 2 spoons instead of one beside my tea. The cook began leaving extra rolls near his seat. Even the older woman who managed the house no longer referred to me as the girl. One morning, she called me by my first name, and I realized it was the first time I'd heard it since I arrived. It felt both foreign and familiar, like an old coat found in a forgotten drawer. Elenor, I whispered it to myself later that day, alone in the library. Elenor and Thorn, 2 names that now lived in the same house, in the same air, not as owners, not as duty, but as something almost tender.
We weren't in love, not yet. Not quite, but we were becoming something neither of us had expected. A kind of closeness born not from passion, but from the shared softness of survival.
And that, in its own way, was more sacred. He began writing again.
I found folded pages tucked between the books we shared, not always addressed to me, but always
meant for me to find. Reflections,
memories,
questions with no pressure to answer. We were still learning each other.
But we were no longer strangers.
We were no longer waiting. That night, as snow began to fall again in thin, drifting sheets, I stood by the window in my room and watched the world quiet itself. The trees bowed gently beneath the weight. The fields turned pale and endless, and the path we had once walked together disappeared under the softness. I held one of his pages in my hands, words written with care, ink slightly smudged at the corners, as if
he had paused while writing. Do you think we were meant to meet, or just placed? That was the question.
I didn't answer it on paper. I didn't know how.
But I thought about it as I watched the snow collect on the windowsill.
What was fate, anyway?
A name spoken. In a closed room.
A hand offered in the orchard. A silence that became shelter.
I didn't know. But I knew this. I didn't feel placed anymore.
I didn't feel traded or positioned or forgotten.
I felt chosen not by him, perhaps. Not by myself either, but by the quiet understanding that had grown between us.
The kind you don't find in loud rooms or planned ceremonies, but in quiet mornings and folded notes and the way someone waits. For your yes.
I blew out the candle, slid the letter beneath my pillow, and slipped under the blankets. Outside, the wind moved gently through the eaves, like it had learned to speak softly for those still learning how to stay.
As I drifted into sleep, I whispered his name one more time just to myself, just to feel how it fit inside the quiet. Thought. It didn't feel strange anymore. It felt like something that had waited patiently to be known. And with that, I let myself rest not with certainty, but with ease.
Because even without a future written, even without promises spoken aloud, I knew that something had taken root in that house.
Something quiet, something real, and for the first time since I was
told to leave my home, I did not dream of running. Spring arrived without a clear announcement, just the soft retreat of frost from the window panes and the gentle return of birdsong before dawn. The trees, still bare, carried a new kind of silence.
Not the hush of winter, but the anticipation of life.
The air changed.
So did the light, and slowly, so did we. Thorn began joining me in the library more often. Sometimes we read in the same chair, the space between us not wide enough to call distant, not close enough to name fully. Other times we sat by the window, sharing a blanket draped over both our shoulders as we watched the orchard stir beneath patches of thawed soil.
We still didn't talk about what we were becoming.
There was no need. It lived in the way he handed me a book without being asked, or how he waited for me at the bottom of the stairs each morning without saying a word. Once, while trimming the garden's edges together, he brushed soil from my sleeve.
His fingers lingered for a second longer than necessary, and I felt it not the touch, but the permission.
To stay, to belong.
I began planting things again.
Lavender, mostly. Some rosemary. A few seeds I didn't recognize but wanted to believe in anyway. He built me a small box by the window to keep them safe from the late frost. We never named it mine or yours. It simply became ours. A quiet little world growing between two people who had once been strangers. He watched over the box like he did me not with control, but with presence. The kind that says, I am here if you need me, and still here if you don't. One morning, while watering the lavender, I caught him watching me through the window. He didn't wave. I didn't either.
But our eyes met through the glass, and in that stillness, it felt like everything spoken was finally being understood without having
to be said. Some days, I wondered what the others in the house believed about us.
If they thought we were simply fulfilling our roles bride and groom to be, cohabiting until duty became familiarity.
But we weren't building a marriage in the traditional sense. There were no rehearsals,
no promises spoken over ledgers or lace. What we were shaping was slower, more deliberate.
Less a structure, more a rhythm.
A pattern of nearness. At night, he would pause by my door not to speak, not to linger, but just long enough for me to hear his steps and know I was not forgotten. I began leaving my door slightly ajar.
Not wide, not obvious, just enough. One evening, as the light
faded into violet behind the hills, he knocked softly once and asked, "May I sit with you a while?"
I nodded, my heart answering before my voice could.
We sat side by side on the small bench near the hearth.
No fire,
just the warmth of proximity. I offered him half the shawl draped over my shoulders, and he accepted it without a word.
We didn't touch, but we didn't need to. The silence between us had grown comfortable. No longer a question, but a kind of answer. He looked at the wall where the candlelight moved slowly across the stone, and said, I never imagined I'd find quiet that didn't feel like loneliness. I didn't know what to say, so I rested my head against the wood behind me and let
His words hang in the air, soft as thread. Outside, the wind whispered across the roof like a lullaby, and I thought maybe this is what a beginning feels like.
not fireworks,
Not declarations,
but presence.
someone choosing to sit beside you, with nothing to prove and everything to offer, simply by being near. That night, after he left, I didn't close the door fully,
And I slept the deepest I had.
since the day I was told to leave home. Not long after that evening, I began waking before the sun.
It wasn't restlessness. It was a kind of readiness, a soft pull inside me that wanted to be awake before the world moved. I'd rise, wrap myself in a shawl, and step quietly into the hallway, where the air still held the cool breath of night. Sometimes I'd find Thorn already in the library, half asleep in the chair by the window, a book resting open across his lap, and his hand curled near his cheek like a child in dreaming. I never woke him. I'd sit across the room and watch the morning unfold through the glass. We didn't need sunrise to begin the day. The quiet was enough. One morning, he opened his eyes and saw me sitting there, barefoot on the rug, hair still loose from sleep. He didn't speak. He just smiled softly, not with amusement, but with recognition, like he had dreamt I'd be there, and waking only confirmed it. This feels like home, I said, the words falling out before I could weigh them. He didn't look away. It is, he replied, and that was all. Not a promise, not a condition, just an offering. A place, a presence, a sense of belonging neither of us had asked for, but both had learned how to hold. That day, while sweeping the corridor, I found a ribbon on the floor. It was mine old, worn at the edges, from my first week in the house. I picked it up and tied it around the knob of my door. Not for decoration, not for show, but as a small mark. A symbol that said, this space holds something. This story lives here. Later, when I passed by, I saw he had tied a small string frayed at one end, likely from the stables on his own door. No one else would know what it meant, but I did, and so did he. Two quiet signs, side by side. Not loud, not labelled, but deeply seen. Spring unfolded gently, like a hand slowly unclenching. The orchard bloomed, pale blossoms emerging on branches that had once seemed barren forever. I walked among them each morning, the hem of my dress brushing dew from the grass, the scent of newness folding itself around my shoulders. Ford would join me sometimes, but not always, and that felt right. We had learned by then that love didn't always arrive in shared sentences. Sometimes it arrived in presence unspoken, but steady. One morning, I brought a book and sat beneath the tree with the split trunk, the one where he had first told me his name. I didn't read. I just watched the petals fall, one by one, slowly, like they had nowhere else to be. When I heard his footsteps behind me, I didn't turn. I knew it was him. You never asked if I wanted to stay, I said softly. There was no accusation in my voice, just a quiet truth. He sat beside me, close enough for warmth, far enough for air. I didn't know if I had the right, he replied. I looked at him then, not as a girl looking at the boy she was told to marry, but as a woman seeing someone who had stayed when he could have left. And now? I asked. He looked down at his hands, then back at the tree, where a single blossom clung, to the branch as the wind tugged gently. Now, I hope you already know that you don't have to. I nodded. The wind moved again, and the last blossom fell. I caught it in my palm without meaning to, and I smiled, because I did know. Without declarations, without signatures, without anything official, I knew I was no longer the girl who arrived wrapped in silence. I was the woman who stayed because she chose to. And in that orchard, beneath a sky that had finally stopped hiding the sun, I let go of the past not with anger, not with regret, but with the soft certainty that I had found something no one had promised me. Something better, something mine. Later that day, I returned to my room and opened the drawer where I had kept the letters, the ones we had written in silence, scattered across books and afternoons. I didn't read them. I didn't need to. I knew every word by heart now, not because I had memorized them, but because they had become part of the air I breathed here. I bundled them with a ribbon, one of mine, pale blue,
slightly faded from the sun, and placed them inside the small wooden box by my bed.
The same box Thorn had carved for me during those early weeks when we still measured our closeness in glances.
I didn't seal it.
I wanted it to stay easy to open, like the rest of our story.
He found me at the end of the hallway, where the light pooled golden on the floor. I was holding my shoes in one hand, barefoot, the way I used to be as
a child when the earth still felt like home.
He looked at me as if I was still the girl, brave in ways I hadn't noticed, steady in my quiet.
You're leaving? He asked, not with fear, just with the weight of wanting to understand. I shook my head. No, I'm just going outside without anything between me and the ground. He smiled, and not with his mouth, but with his eyes,
the way he always had when something truly mattered. We walked side by side, through the corridor and into the garden. The earth was soft beneath my feet, and I felt every curve, every stone, every pulse of life waiting just beneath the surface.
I looked at him and said, "Thank you."
He didn't ask for what.
He just took my hand, not quickly, not desperately, but with the kind of care that says, "I know where you've been, and I'm not going anywhere." And we stood there, as the afternoon light wrapped around us like a final sentence we didn't need to write.
Because some endings don't end.
They just settle into the body quiet, deep, and meant to stay that evening. I wrote one final note, not
because anything had been left unsaid, but because I had learned that sometimes the act of writing is a way of thanking silence for what it has given.
I wrote it slowly, the candlelight flickering across the page, the shadows of my hand dancing with each letter.
I was promised before I ever kissed anyone, but it was here that I learned what it meant to be chosen.
Not by a voice, not by a name, but by someone who stayed.
I folded it and placed it in the library, not inside a book this time, but on the windowsill, where the light would find it first in the morning.
Then I returned to my room,
opened the window slightly, and let the night air in.
The scent of lavender
drifted in with it, soft, familiar. I lay in bed with the covers pulled to my chin, my fingers gently tracing the wooden edge of the box beside me.
I didn't feel lost anymore. I didn't feel exchanged or erased.
I felt
known.
The kind of known that has nothing to do with facts or history, and everything to do with being seen when you aren't trying to be. Outside, the orchard moved in the breeze. Somewhere, a barn door creaked softly.
And not far from my room, I
could hear the familiar rhythm of his steps returning from the garden. I didn't need to turn the light back on. I didn't need to rise. I simply waited calm, rested, rooted.
The door creaked open slightly, and I heard him pause, just like always. Then the sound of the chair by the fire shifting under his weight.
He would sit there for a while, I knew,
not speaking, not asking for anything, just sharing the quiet with me, the way he always had. And that, I thought as my eyes began to close, was what love looked like here, not grand, not loud, just present, just near, just enough.